Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to CityLit's virtual event with What We Inherit, A Secret War and a Family Search for Answers, and her conversation partner for tonight, Sarah Blakley-Cartwright. Jessica is a writer and editor living in Brooklyn. Her work has appeared in Atlas Obscura, Greatest, The History Channel, The Huffington Post, and Refinery 29. Previously, she was senior lifestyle editor at The Huffington Post, director of content at SoulCycle, and a staff member at the Pan American Center, which is the world's oldest literary human rights organization. Her first job in New York City was a book publicist at St. Martin's Press. She's a graduate of Brown University, where she received a research grant to conduct an oral history on World War II. This is her first book. Sarah is the director of the Chicago Review of Books, associate editor of A Public Space, and host of the reading series at the Art Gallery Karma. In 2011, she published the New York Times bestseller Red Riding Hood, which is also a film starring Amanda Seyfried and produced by Leonardo DiCaprio in the same year. So we're thrilled to have you guys here. Sorry, not in the store. Very excited about this conversation. Everybody, please join me in welcoming them to City Lit.
Thank you. Yeah. So to get started, Sarah, do you want me to give me a brief rundown of the book and then we can kind of go from there?
Yeah.
Sure. So What We Inherit is a book I've been working on for over 10 years. So I'm so excited it's finally here, even if it is in the midst of a global pandemic. And it's a deeply, deeply personal story. It begins in the wake of my mother's death when I uncovered boxes of declassified CIA documents and all pointed to a family secret, and that was my Uncle Jack, who disappeared when his plane was shot down in Laos on March 29, 1972, and never came home. Jack's crash echoed one my family had already experienced. My grandpa was a B-17 bomber in World War II, parachuted out of a burning plane, was captured by the Nazis, and spent over almost 3 years in Stalag 17 prison camp. And because he survived, he always believed that his son did too. So 40 years after my grandpa went to Laos in search of Jack, I followed in his footsteps. And the closer I got to the last known place Jack was seen alive, the closer I got to understanding the family that I missed, but also the mysteries of a war that left Laos the most heavily bombed country in the entire world. That's more bombs than in Japan combined in World War II. And very few Americans talk about it. So the book is a mix of it's deeply researched historical narrative, and it's also a little bit of travelogue. So now Sarah and I, we were talking about what to read from on our kind of pre-conversation. I'm going to read you briefly from the prologue, and then I'm actually going to mix things up and read from chapter 2, which is from my grandfather's perspective, the morning he learns that his son is shot down. So the book goes between my perspective and modern day, the morning my mom is lost, and then looking for her across Southeast Asia, and then grandpa waking up the morning Jack is gone. And without further ado, here is What We Inherit. I'll do a quick 5-minute reading, then we'll dive into our convo. Ours is a family that loses children. Grandpa Ed cheated death when he jumped out of a burning plane at 22. He has thrown to the Western Front so fast he hadn't been trained to use a parachute. The German farmers who found him in their field sent him to Stalag 17 for 2.5, saved his life, but marked the man for good. He could never again stomach the smell of soup, though he let his grandkids play with his prison spoon. It was Ed's brother that we lost, long after the war. He drowned while on vacation, his young son and daughter watching him kick and splash as the canoe drifted away. Ed's oldest son and namesake, Edwin Jack Pearce, followed his father into the Air Force. He disappeared over the war and stayed missing for 36 years. Ed's daughter, my mother, found her tumor at 53. The hearts of some families would have drowned with that first boy, stopped with that plane crash, frozen at that moment of discovery. Ours kept beating because we knew what it was to wait. Chapter 2, Gunner's Moon. Mom was the one tasked with waking her father up for work as a kid. She used to tell me how she'd lightly touch his shoulder and whisper as loud as she dared, "Dad, it's time to get up." He used to bolt right up, she told me. For those first few moments, her dad was replaced with another man, his blue eyes seeing soldiers and walls that weren't there. But then his eyes would find mine, she told me, and he'd come back to me. He always seemed so big to me, like nothing bad could happen to you while he was there. Milford, Pennsylvania, March 29th, 1972. There was a full moon the night Jack's plane is shot down, a gunner's moon, bright enough to make anything that crosses the clouds an easy target. Grandpa Ed hasn't flown in a waist gunner's seat in years, but the memory of that exposure never leaves you. The waist gunner's view on a B-17 is open to the sky, the cold biting at your face as you cling to the 50 calibers. Standing as your captain brings you in low, the houses and roads coming at you fast in the moonlight. Ed lies awake next to his wife as the full moon rises over Milford, Pennsylvania, and shines through the white lace curtains Rosemary had sewn in 47, back when she was a new bride and the lawn was dirt, and he started having nightmares. It's often a truck backfiring on Route 6 that sets my grandfather's heart racing. The big ones that lumber down the valley to refuel, passing the small white house in the darkness on their way to northern cities. Sometimes it's the lone cars that wake him, whirring like blood rushing through his ears as they approach. He'll startle awake and hold his breath, following the sound of their engines growing louder until their headlights illuminate the bedroom. There, to his immediate relief, is his wife asleep beside him, lying on her back with her mouth slightly open. His polished boots are lined up against his side of the bed, just as he'd left them. His kids are smiling up from the mismatched frames on Rosie's dressing table, holding fishing posts they've long since outgrown. Gone is the prison camp and the cold and the gunfire. Ed's B-17 was one of 351 Allied planes sent to bomb Schweitfurt, Germany on October 14th. The heavily defended city was home to multiple ball-bearing factories supplying Nazi troops. Ed's plane was nicknamed Patches for the number of repairs that belied its valuable cargo, the bomb site that would direct all of the other Allied planes where to drop their payload. It was the equivalent of holding the flag as you charged the front lines. Most of the anti-aircraft fire was concentrated upon our. My grandfather wrote 45 years to the day of being shot down. The Germans quickly hit their mark. We sustained 3 direct hits from shells, knocking most of our power and including a large hole in the wing tank. We managed to target even though we had a severe gasoline leak. My grandfather watched the bombs fall thousands of feet below, along with the gasoline streaming rapidly from his plane. As we turned back toward France after leaving the target, we were swarmed by enemy fighters. We soon caught fire and the order was given to bail out. We were over 23,000 feet in altitude at the time, and none of us had ever received parachute training. We didn't have our parachute harnesses on tightly enough. Ed had been rushed out to the war at 19, deployed so quickly, there hadn't been time to teach him what he was now being ordered to do. His hands shook as he tried to fasten the buckles before diving toward the earth, the smoke from burning gasoline stinging his eyes. On the parachute descent, many enemy fighters spilled the air out of our parachutes, causing them to collapse, and when they reopened with a snap, caused additional injury to the already injured groin and back. This happened to me 5 times during. The Germans hoarded them like sheep in the sky, and all Grandpa Ed could do was watch as hundreds of white spots clouded the sun. He dislocated his jaw when he fell. His mouth struck open in awe at the death all around him. 63 other US planes were shot down that day, though the Germans fared far worse. 182 out of 184 German fighters were shot down in one of the largest air raids in history. My grandfather came to in a German field. Much to his relief, the farmers who found him didn't shoot him, but rounded him up to be interrogated. The captured men were loaded into boxcars, 60 soldiers into a single car meant for 40. There were no bathrooms. They spent their first night in the railroad yards of Frankfurt while Britain's Royal Air Force bombed the city all around them. The loudness of the bombs, their only indication of how close they were to being destroyed themselves. In his prison ID photo, my grandfather's dark hair is tousled and parted to the right, bangs sweeping across his forehead. Beneath his wild hair, his light eyes stare directly at the camera in Civil War photographs. He'd later tell us that he had tried to cover his face as much as possible in case he had the chance to escape. He spent the next 2 winters in the unheated barracks of Stalag 17B, the prison that would later be the namesake for the 1953 movie directed by Billy Wilder. Even as an old man, my grandfather's feet bothered him. They'd tingle and then lose feeling, like his daughter during chemo decades later. He never truly felt warm. My grandfather was liberated by General Patton's army on May 10th, 1945. From Austria, he was flown to France, where he was able to send a telegram to his mother, his first contact with her in over 6 months. When I find the letter in my mother's papers, it is encased in plastic like a slide specimen. In his telegram, where every letter counts, he used the word home twice. Grandpa Ed was honorably discharged from the military on September 6, 1945. And in March, he got a pension, the reason listed simply as nervous. His firstborn son and namesake, Edwin Jack Pearce, was born on December 8th of the following year. Jack followed his father into the Air Force. The stories of the B-17s edging at the boy's imagination, bleeding into history projects at school, where Ed would talk about what he did during the war to classrooms full of kids who just wanted to know if he'd ever killed anybody. By the time to join up, America was embroiled in Vietnam. As Ed lies in bed in Milford, his son is on his second tour of duty, flying nighttime missions out of Thailand. Ed has to walk by the framed portraits of Jack and my mother hanging in the blue and white wallpapered kitchen. I picture him there in his cotton undershirt, thick brows wild above eyes the color of a cloudless sky, and want to stop the clock, make it like any other morning, to stand with him as he rinses the remnants of yesterday's coffee from the percolator before flicking on the gas stove with his wrist. My grandmother often joked it was the cups and cups of black coffee Ed drank every morning that put the white hair on his chest, arms, and back. He isn't a smoking man or a drinking man, but coffee is the one vice Ed allows himself to relish. That and the pies my grandmother is always throwing together for him. With the children moving on, taking off to start their own lives, it must have felt like it did when he and Rosie were just starting out together. With his focus on the egg timer, counting down the seconds until his coffee is ready, it would have been easy to miss the approaching car slow and turn into the engine cutting as it parked. I wonder if my grandfather caught the slamming of the 2 doors or saw the 2 men approach from the window above the kitchen sink, too early for visitors. I've seen my grandfather pausing, empty coffee cup in hand, hear the doorbell ring with its short, high buzz thrumming through the house like a live current. When you send away someone you love, you fantasize about the front door. You sense their familiar shoulders fill its frame when your back is turned. Every creak of the screen sticks in your throat. You lie in bed not wondering if you locked up the house, but willing someone you're not sure you'll recognize to enter it. Ed had been the ghost to walk through the door at 45. Now he's the parent reaching for the handle. Thank you.
Unmute myself. That was beautiful, Jess. Thank you. Great to hear you read it. You have such a wonderful reading voice. I know that you got to read the audiobook.
Yes, it was actually the last thing I was able to do before New York shut down. I did it a couple days before lockdown went into effect, and I'm so grateful I did, especially now when, the book isn't as available in libraries as it could be, or, bookstores are tougher to get to. So that audiobook has been one of the few ones I can read to people right now, and I'm so grateful.
You're one of the rare authors who get to do that. I know I've heard from quite a few authors who say, well, they made me come and audition, and then they said, oh, we decided to cast someone else, and it's like, this is my personal story. But I see why you're given that. So what an amazing story. Discovering a trove of boxes of declassified CIA documents, letters, and maps occupying your uncle's involvement in a decades-long covert shadow war with dark motives and terrible global implications is something that has never happened to me. And that experience would, be a dazzling treasure trove for a mystery writer, but also could be a altogether sort of disheartening and disturbing discovery for a daughter, a granddaughter, and a niece. And I know, just a mystery writer, I said that sort of facetiously, but I imagine it was some sort of mix of that for you. And I know from reading the book that it was how you found the heart to turn that discovery into a research project, and how much time it took you to recognize that you were the custodian of this story and to decide to tell
Great
it.
questions. So I initially didn't, when I found everything, I was into day life without my mother. I wasn't looking to write a book, but as I spent time with, all of these documents, we were cleaning out my father's house the Christmas after, and something else that Mom was hiding from me, and it was a children's book manuscript. She had sent it to one publisher, got one rejection, and then never sent it anywhere else. And I think I became determined to see my mother's name in print and to see her work published. And while my name's on the front of this book, it says "For Mom" on page 3, and her voice and the brave things that she did is on every single page. It's so, like, in some ways it was a continuation of her mission and my grandfather's mission to let the world know what happened and what our government was doing in Laos all those years.
You really pick right up where your grandfather and your mother left off, and I really feel that that's true, that there are 3 storytellers here, at least 3 actually, but there are these triple strands of sort of narration. It's almost a frame story that you sort of bracketing both your own and his and her suspicions and discoveries. And I say at least because, there are also all these important eyewitness accounts, and people whose testimonies give enormous shape to the story and are, just as important, even if they're just in the space of a few paragraphs. But all of these voices are sort of adding to this story. I am wondering what you felt that someone of your generation could bring to the story. You have the 3, and how that vantage point affected the storytelling.
Great question. I think I had a lot of self-doubt going into this, right? I was not alive for the events of this book. I never got to meet my uncle. I knew my grandfather incredibly well, my mother incredibly well, or I thought I knew them, but then this was basically about all the parts I didn't know for them. But, I had been trained as a journalist. My first time was my grandfather. For 7th grade, I sat him down with a tape recorder with my neon green nails and was like, "Grandpa, tell me about the war." And I parlayed that into that research grant at Brown, where I talked to many, many veterans, male and female, about what they did during World War II. And at the time, my mother was sick with cancer. And my thesis advisor said, I think maybe you should write about Vietnam. You have an uncle. And I was like, I'm not ready to do that. I don't think that's something that my mom would be too upset. It's too much. And then after she died, I realized, like, my God, this generation is getting older too. And just like the urgency I felt to tell the World War II story came back with a vengeance, Vietnam. And I think a lot of the people I talked to for this book had never even talked about what they did during the war. I talked to the son of General Vang Pao, who ran this allied with the CIA and the US government. And his father took him to Long Teng, where the headquarters were, but spoke very little about the war to his son because it was, as his son said, it's too painful. And he actually abruptly got off the phone with me. We had a shorter interview, but I think it affected so many thousands of lives. And now, 50 years on, things are just starting to get declassified. So while I'm younger than perhaps I should be for writing a story about this, I'd also argue that I came to it without maybe some of the preconceptions or notions of what my mother's generation experienced with the protests and all that. And also maybe people were more likely to talk to someone less threatening or younger and open up. And I had a lot of hours and hours long conversations with the grandpas and uncles about what they did. And it reminded me of speaking to my grandfather when I was young, and that feeling I so missed of being entrusted with someone's story.
Yeah, and you we're interested with his story here, and you do him so much justice. Ed was such a powerful storyteller, and his voice just resonates throughout the book. You know, his voice is almost a refrain. I'll just read one part. Although I spent over 600 days as a prisoner of war of the Nazis in World War I, and one of my sons is World War II, and one of my sons is still unaccounted for in Southeast Asia, I believe this system of government is the best ever created by man. Deceitful is the nation that, having heroes, betrays them.
And that's one of the milder ones too, but that's pretty strong. Yeah.
Yes, it builds, and then you've mentioned that his letters and the transcripts of the trial showcasing his enormous bravery enabled you to get to know him before his stroke. Could you talk a little bit about the legacy of language in your family?
Very much so. I mean, my grandmother and my grandfather never made it beyond high school. To where my grandmother became a housewife and bagged groceries at the local store. So growing up, they were very loving to me. Experienced the writing beyond a birthday card. They were so loving and so present. They told incredible oral histories. You'd gather around the dining table and spend hours. And my cousin Zach, who's on this call, can attest to it. They were just incredible storytellers. But the shocking thing for me, especially in my research for the book, there is a scene, that's the trial scene. It's basically verbatim, a transcript of this 1979 status review hearing where the government wanted to declare my uncle dead with the passage of time without any evidence. It was just like, okay, it's been 4 years. He's done. Drew from Pennsylvania to Texas with stacks and stacks of this like research-based, incredibly nuanced argument. And I read about my grandmother's senior Air Force brass and defend her son and walk circles around these highly educated, very powerful men. And it was just, as a granddaughter, an incredible moment, but also as a writer, like I didn't have to invent dialogue or voice here because the voice was like screaming at me from these old documents. And I'm so glad that they saved them. And even in things they didn't write, I could watch with pencil underline something until it ripped a hole through the paper. And I could tell that's when she was angry, right? I knew she's even speaking when she's writing. And it was just, their voices, I can still hear them in my head. And I think that really propelled me to keep going, especially when what I was reading was difficult to read or upsetting.
You describe your shock at seeing your mother's handwritten letter to the president, and that it made you re-examine everything that had come before between the two of you. What was it that shocked you to your core so much in that letter?
Yeah, it was just, I mentioned she had tried to publish that article and it didn't happen, and she never really tried again. She was an incredibly strong woman, especially with her illness, especially raising two, I think, very strong daughters. But I'd never seen her political life. We didn't talk about politics or death. And here was a letter where she was not only writing to the president and got a response, by the way, was saying, I have concrete evidence that you're wrong. I know he's alive. And then it also kind of revealed she had flown to Paris, a trip I did not know about when she was roughly my age, and marched into the Vietnamese and the Laos embassies without an appointment, without the ability to speak French, and talked to these people. She talked to the ambassador to Vietnam a couple weeks before Saigon fell. And no one was going to turn her away. And I think of her as well when I was writing this book. She was 24 years old. She was female, she was blonde, and that people didn't expect her to do. And she did them because she loved her brother. And I think love for family and grief can drive us to some pretty wild things. And I definitely felt her with me as I was writing this too.
Yeah, and that comes through. I mean, she hunted for her brother for 4 decades. I mean, the scale, family has its battles, but not at this scale, I mean, the opponents that she was taking on in your grandparents, national government. Anyway, it's just mind-boggling. And the enormity of the task, what they were after. Rosemary and Eddie are seeking not just their son, but answers. Your mother, not just her brother, but justice under the law, And then I wonder, with all of this, it's something that we talked about, touched on earlier, but with all of this search for answers and then yet in your own home, under your own roof, as your mother's condition worsened, the concept of death was evaded, or sort of, if I have that right. Maybe.
Yeah. Do you want me to speak to kind of why these things weren't discussed, or?
Oh, I forget what we sort of talked about earlier, but if that's not a good.
No. So I think my mother had spent so many weekends of her life marching on Washington and protesting and fighting. I think when she finally became ill, she modeled the way she treated her cancer, like the way her father treated her brother's disappearance and his grief, which is to keep a stiff upper lip and keep going. It wasn't denial per se, so much as like, I'm not going to let this beat me down. I'm going to keep going. And she was given months to live and lasted 3 years, long enough to find out what happened to her brother. And I really credit her father's example for that. And one moment I always return to, especially now in the global pandemic. So when my grandfather was in Stalag 17, he wrote curfew every night to read from a small book of prayers. And he could have been killed for that because there was lights out. The Nazis weren't exactly lenient about bedtime stories, but it was kind of a defiant reminder of life for him. And years later, when my mom was undergoing chemo, she read from that same book to feel connected to her father's strength. And every time I talk to this story, I'm in a small bedroom. We're all kind of in our homes right now. It's another scary time. And I think whether you're in a prison or a prison of your body, or in a global pandemic and stuck in the four walls of your home, storytelling is a way out. And it's a way to connect with the people that we love and miss.
That's beautiful. And the book is called What We Inherit. So I'm thinking about Heritance, and what does that title mean to you? What legacy did you inherit from your mother and your grandfather?
Yeah. So, my uncle went up into the plane that was like his father, and my mom wanted to be an editor, was for a short time before she had children. So I think becoming an editor and a journalist and a writer was so much kind of following in her footsteps. But the title is actually taken from the Lord Byron poem Prometheus, which kind of forms the frontispiece of the book. And that has a hugely, Jack was shot down in a plane called Prometheus, named after the Greek titan who gave fire to man. So, a bomber, fire to man. But in the myth, Prometheus is punished and he's strapped to a mountain. And every night, depending on the version of the story that you read, he's either has his heart or his liver eaten out. So he can never actually quite die. He is just caught in this limbo between life and death. Like my family for 36 years was caught between hope and despair. And the eagle was also a symbol, because the symbol of the Air Force, of course, is that eagle. And you see it stamped on all these official documents, throwing my family wildly again into hope and despair. So our dreams and our hopes for the next generation. But it's very deeply how we love, how we grieve, and how we learn to let go. I think we talked about this a little bit too. My grandfather admitted he didn't spend as much time with his children because he was so obsessed with his focus for Jack. And my mother's piano lessons and dancing, all the things she gave my sister and I think were in a deep, deep response to her own gap for so much of it.
Yes, interesting. Yes, and your grandfather's sort of unceasing belief in his son's, imminent return. And because he himself survived believing, oh, it can happen again. If it happens once, it will happen. The idea, time was sort of stalled in certain ways as they all held on to hope. And I wondered if you worried in picking up this story about falling into that pattern yourself.
I was deeply sucked into that pattern. I spent my entire 20s on this book. I would fall asleep with CIA documents in bed with me instead of a boyfriend. Like I how this type of work is, and it's something that you love and you're passionate about, but it can take over your life. And because it was my family, I think I was largely unable for years to draw a healthy boundary around it. Because there's chapters called Letting Go, and at the end page, I basically say, part of loving someone is learning when to let them go. But I will say, going back to what we mentioned about recording the audiobook, I knew the pandemic was coming. I didn't know what would happen with the book or with my friends or with my city. But when I read the entire book from beginning to end out loud, like when I started saying the last words, that's crying and feeling the enormity of all of this, right? That's when I felt like I could let go. It wasn't when I finished writing. I didn't feel the closure when we did the beautiful cover, which I love, by the way, Olivia and Chris, thank you. It was saying it out loud, saying my mother's name, my grandfather's name out loud, and knowing their story is going to be here and it's not going anywhere.
Here. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess it's sort of like the inheritance idea. You inherit raw material, you make of it what you can. And I do imagine that an outstanding question, you know, during that decade of research that you did, you know, poring over thousands of documents and correspondence that you had a Freedom of Information Act, whether, you know, a question was how to give shape to this story of such magnitude. And you decided to embed some of those declassified documents so that readers discover them. And I wonder if that was always part of the conception or what you felt that brought to the storytelling for them to have that experience.
Sure,
Similar to you covered in the pages, except we have it all in one place.
Oh yeah, you can even see like one of the CIA documents here. It's basically all black bars. Yeah, when I initially envisioned this book, I thought I would have all the answers. I would get the CIA on the record and it would just be this like mystery that was solved. And it obviously ended up being a lot more nuanced and that. And so what I could do is recreate that sense of suspense over 36 years. The reader discovers these declassified documents. You hold the prayer book my grandpa had in your hand because it's basically recreated in this book. I wanted you to be part of the family. And I think the way that was done was just not through my eye, modern day voice when it's all in the past. My grandfather holding Jack's dog tags in his hands as you, the reader, are kind of holding them in yours. And it recreated really a lot of how I wrote the book. There was this really transformative moment when I was in bed with the CIA documents, which is my sexy 20s, and something cold and metallic fell in my lap, and it was Jack's dog tags, which I didn't know we had. And that's when I knew the book had to be told in a personal perspective. It couldn't be this reported journalistic thing that I had envisioned in my head. It really was to include that emotion because that emotion made the history personal for me, and hopefully will make it personal for me.
Yes, it is an amazing, I mean, it's a mix of it, you know, all these genres, and then it's also this amazing mixture of your smaller histories making a bridge to this big mother's, you know, lives would be, you know, omissions, estates, omissions, you know, mixing those levels gives the book such an incredible, you know, and as you process your individual firsthand story of grief, you know, squared for both of them, you're at the same time collecting, you know, processing this collective vision or understanding of these, you know, futile decades of war where, you know, a plane load of bombs was dropped every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. So it's just an amazing high wire act to bring all of those things together.
Yeah, and I think that was a thing I struggled with the most when we first went out with this book. I went to all the big 5 publishers in Manhattan, and they were all kind of saying, well, you know, you can write a book about your mom being sick, but it can't also be a book about war. Like, they write books about war that sell, so can you make it something else? And I think it was all meant to be, because Chris Heiser and Olivia Taylor-Smith at Unnamed Press really saw this book for the hybrid that it could be. And I think, as you pointed out, the different strains actually strengthen it in a lot of ways, and it becomes a book that isn't just like, here's a comp title that you can compare it to. It becomes its own thing, which I think A Secret War and A Family Secret, there were just enough things there to stand on their own and maybe create something new.
Yes, I you know, I'm just thinking with you did all that research in your bed, but then you did on the ground research, just like those who came before you, and you know, your mother and your grandparents were intentionally misled so many times in so many ways, receiving contradictory information from a government trying to cover its tail, you know, to sanitize the true story and to compensate for its own, you know, violence. And that sense of powerlessness that were then lit up by these moments of breakthrough, the report of the 9 soldiers, but then they can't find the document. And then they find the document, and then the document's discounted. And then we reach out to the press. No, he doesn't write back. So anyway, I'm curious, not that we need to name names necessarily, but I'm curious who tried to stop you along the way. I know that you encountered many sort of veterans and CIA officers who were unwilling initially to go on record, or that it was very challenging to get.
And I think when it comes to Secret War, there were so many really atrocities and scary things that happened. And I think Vietnam, we know about a couple of them, right? And they're taught in history books now, but with Laos, it's still very much private. So to survive something like that, no matter what side you're on, you're going to be pretty careful about who you share it with and who you tell it to. And yes, while I am a journalist, I think being young and being female, maybe taken as seriously, or perhaps people approach me. I felt, at least my experience was, people were willing to talk to me, especially if I talked about my own family first. If I said, hi, I'm not just a journalist, by the way, I lost a family member here, can you help me out? The first people I kind of got to were the fellow soldiers that served with Jack, and they were kind of a rise. The Air Force is like their entire lives, but they, when they'd start telling me these stories, one guy, he kept saying, it's a word that begins with P. It refers to a woman's genitalia. And he kept like censoring himself, but like wanting to say it. And then I was like, man, you can just say it to me. It's fine. He's like, but you're a lady. And I was like, no, so it was just hearing in their own words, that was a little bit of self-censorship. And then I had some really lucky breaks as well. The CIA was the hardest to get on the record for, they're trained to not give up secrets, even under torture. So I went about it in a very peaceful way, which was my book club. I have a friend, Gigi, who told me, oh, you're writing a book about Laos. My dad was in Laos in the 70s. And I was like, was your dad CIA? And she's like, how did you know that? So I ended up talking to him. Yeah. And he, Power Club. So never underestimate the power of a book club to connect you with incredible human beings. But he would describe,
gets flowing.
Exactly, wine or whiskey.
Secrets come out.
Yeah, like he described drinking whiskey and Vinshen with like the Russians and the Chinese, and the next morning like going back to the war and like killing each other, and that was crazy. And when I did go to Laos, I didn't ask for official government permission to do the research that I did. I did go as a tourist, which felt safer to me at the time, but I was a young 20-something, and what did I know? I was very lucky, a lot of risks, but overall, I think when you're, after losing my mom, I didn't kind of felt like the worst thing that it could possibly happen to me had happened. And I was just so determined to kind of finish her story that I think I often lost sight of real danger or real things on the ground. And that was a driving force, but also one I'm not sure I would have today when I have kind of a different life.
Yeah. I mean, the climate in which you're reporting in Laos, with those under that heavy censorship and reporting news that weakens the state, carries a jail sentence, and only government sanctioned news is something else at risk of imprisonment or death for defamation. We had spoken about that, but the state on the rise. And while you met with much kindness and generosity, I know you also faced a lot of hostility and ill omens. You were an unmarked van with an unknown guide in order to traipse through dark moonlit jungles, literally seeking out an aircraft that was carrying a load of unexploded cluster bombs that still kill an average of 50 people a year. At what moment in this storytelling were you afraid? Did you ever think of turning back?
I think I was most afraid when I was, and it was a fear mixed with a sense of I shouldn't be here. Like, what is my right to be here? I'm a white woman. I'm walking in a village that my uncle was bombing. Like I walked to this one house in the village, and there was a little boy's Superman pajamas dangling over a laundry line. It's a symbol of American goodwill and power and hero, but it was over a bomb crater left by American bombs. And there's like graves right behind it, one side, in the school where all these kids are getting out of school and walking towards me. And it wasn't a fear so much as like, what right to drag up the past and ask these people about their lives. And that was something I hope I communicate throughout the book. I wanted to write not just my family's story of this war, but really educate Americans about what we collectively did there. And so when I talked to refugees, when I went to the War Museum, where, you know, and we see in history books, you know, Americans marching at Kent State and other college campuses against the war, there were Laos students marching in Chen against the war on their side. And their museums are a museum to victory, right? They beat the American aggressors, as they call them, against all odds in a war that was, for their mind, independence. And so I really felt if I was going to write this thing, I better make damn sure that I make sure that to the best of my ability, I can present not just my family's story, but a version of the war. And I look forward to other books written by the Lao people to come out of this and really continue the story when it's safe to do so. I think within the country, it's still very challenging to report, but there's a huge population in the United States of people that were displaced because of this war. Over a quarter of the population had to leave as a result of it.
I'm thinking also of your scene in the Buddhist temple where you're standing there and amidst the wreckage and just thinking like, oh my God. But I'll leave that for other readers to discover. But it's a beautiful scene. And yes, all of this climate roiling around you and all of this, you know, creates this incredible sense of tension that drives the narrative and urgency. You know, a family secret, years of deception, decades of lies stemming from, you know, devastating loss occasioned by the CIA. I wonder if you were ever reluctant or fearful that this context of the story, which was, you know, as we've discussed, both so public and finally so intimate, could be at risk of too much publishers, or like, you know, the far end would be sensational, you know, sort of too much overbright excitement from a public, or if that ever entered into
From like the CIA aspect of it, or from like sharing so much of my family?
Oh, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking about maybe in your family, in the intimate, you know, sharing something so intimate that then is also so big.
Yeah. So having lost so much of my family so young, you know, my mom passed away. My sister moved here. We're still very close, but I see her, you know, once a year because she is further away. The thing I wanted was to lose more family by writing about them and having them go away. But I'm very lucky. I have family members on the call. Now, actually, my cousin Zach and Stacy, who just got married. Hi, guys. They not only read the book, but encouraged me in it. And, you know, the very first person who speaks in the book is my Uncle Kim, who's Zach's dad. And he was very open with me about that was his big brother. He was the baby in the family, but he remembers these events incredibly well. And I didn't censor myself or change the version of the story I wanted to tell. I showed it to them and said, this is what I'm publishing. I hope you still love me. But another reason I think I wanted to spend so much time with my family, Mary Carr is one of my favorite memoirists. And she has this amazing quote that like writing memoir is like spending time with people no longer on this side of the grass. And, you know, throughout my 20s, I was reading my grandfather's letters and hearing his voice and my mother. And it was like getting to meet my mom at my age and also kind of mother through a daughter's eyes. And yeah, ultimately it's not necessarily, I think, revealing about my family so much as continuing what they themselves had set forward, which was a determination to get this story told. And get it on.
A lot of sense. Thank you for answering that. Are you a reader of thrillers and mysteries? I'm wondering what books are in this book's DNA, just because it's so multi-genre, as we've discussed, you know, part memoir, part investigative reporting, part travelogue even. Were those techniques you were familiar with, the storytelling?
Yeah, so I mean, my first job was actually at St. Martin's Press, and I was the publicist for Thrillers and Mysteries, so I'm sure some of that kind of bled into my work. But my favorite books are often kind of hybrid nonfiction. So Ron Chernow, the author of Alexander Hamilton, blurb of the book, and he just takes history that we've all heard 1,000 million times, been hurt over the head with, and makes it fresh and makes it new and made Hamilton a thing, you know. And I just I look to him so much for inspiration about like how to portray a war in a way that makes it feel like it just happened yesterday. Sebastian Junger's writing about war was another huge inspiration. He also luckily blurbed the book. You know, it's a way of not just depicting a soldier as a fallen hero, but as a boy. Like in this book, you see Jack from the perspective of a young woman who had a crush on him growing up and remembers giving him rides in her convertible, but you also see him, you know, drinking a little bit later on and coming back from the war a different person. So you see this boy that you could have gone to high school with, or could have been enjoying that kind of honesty that he has about war. So.
That's great.
And then Kate Bollock, one more. She wrote Spinster, and she's actually from my hometown of Newburyport, Massachusetts. And she combined her favorite writers, which is like just like really strong female characters with history, with personal memoir about losing her mother as well. So that was also kind of someone that lit the way for me to explore layering personal story over a larger historical moment.
I think my favorite one of those is Joanne Beard's Io. Do you know that essay from her collection Boys of My Youth? It's so beautiful, but she was teaching at Virginia Tech when the shooting happened there. And, you know, in the physics office, she was actually teaching in the physics office, and she pairs the tragedy with her divorce from her husband. And it's just something that you would never could live alongside each other. You know, brave, very brave to have done it, and it just works so beautifully. Anyway, I recommend. Yes. So I see that people are wanting to chime into the Q&A, so I'm just going to maybe close with, I guess, the idea of closure. Let's close with that. You know, the book is in so many ways about the impossibility of finding answers, you know, and learning to live with irresolution. You know, after all of this, you reserve until the very end for a short section, and it's both very blunt and poetic, and kind of seems to ask, how can something so concrete as this be so elusive? Yeah, the theme of the book is how to reach a satisfying ending in our stories about ourselves and our stories about our families, a comforting sense of finality that's always sort of just out of reach. What did all this teach you about endings and maybe about beginnings?
Sure. I had this sense that, you know, I quote my father in the ending of the book, and, you know, there was a day when my mom woke up and didn't feel like her brother was alive anymore. She had this, and he was gone, and she was pregnant with me at the time. And my dad was like, it was kind of like she was ready to let go of him and watch you start to breathe and kind of live your first. And that really stuck with me. You know, I got married just last May, and I miss my mom desperately. Like, I think I cried more in that 1 year after 10 years of missing her than I have in my whole life. And it just, because I realized, like, she lost Jack. Jack was declared dead by the government a month before her wedding. And I think there are always moments in my life where I will miss her. If I ever have children, I know I'll be thinking strongly of her. But my life is going to keep going on. I'm going to be older than her, God willing, one day. And for me, the way that my grandfather could not let go of his son, it brought us closure. Eventually, my mother worked for it too, but there was a cost to that as well. And a big theme of the book is knowing when to let go. And it doesn't mean disrespecting and erasing and forgetting or silencing. What it means is carrying them with you in a way where you can still breathe on your own. Like that, it's not a weight, but something that actually bolsters you and makes you feel like the best parts of them are still there.
Wow. Wow. That's very powerful. Beautiful. Well, that seems like a great place to open up to our group. Let me just open my, okay, where is my Teresa section?
There's a question in the group chat too.
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry, I am looking in all of my sections here. If you see it, go ahead. You can. Oh yeah, I do see one. Oh, okay. I see. Sorry. Getting settled. Okay. We have a question. Aren't aware of what happened in Laos and the U.S. role in that country. The history was important to your story, yet probably overwhelming in terms of how much of it to tell. Was that difficult?
Very much so. And the original version of the book, I don't think had enough about the war in it. So Olivia, my editor, Nicole, had the really strong suggestion of creating a preface that kind of lays out the war for you. So, I think establishing things like numbers, like what you mentioned, they were bombed every 8 minutes for 9 years. And just like being able to pit those numbers against the personal story. So like the task of the first 4 pages is really like, this is the years that it happened. This is the history of the country. And also like I go to a history museum in Vientiane where you get an active travel log scene, but you're also learning about this history of this country that was actually many different tribes, many different languages coming together. There was a history of the low along with the mountainous tribes. So the United States came in and really took advantage of that. They were already set against, let's give these guys weapons and have them fight for us versus their thousands-year-old enemies and see how that goes. So I wanted to not get bogged down in the details, but also give you enough groundwork to, if you wanted as a reader after this book is over, and I hope you do, learn more about this war. Joshua Kurlansik is an incredible writer. His book came out, I think 2 or 3 years ago now. It's called A Great Place to Have a War. And it's largely the CIA. He sees Laos as the first time the CIA actively kind of created wars that they then used to kind of give them status and clout in Latin America and in the Middle East. So there's so much more that's not in this book. It's just really the iceberg and enough.
Can you repeat what that book is called?
Oh yes, A Great Place to Have a War.
Great Place to Have a War.
By Joshua Kurlansik, nonfiction.
Great. I'll send that to the chat. Kurlansik. I'll put SP question. Hopefully you can Google it by then. We have another question. Jess, your book is amazing. I couldn't put it down, your family, and now my family in it. Do you have a favorite moment in the book, whether it is a personal memory or a storytelling moment? From Stacey.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorites are ones at the end that I don't give away. So I think one that really stuck with me, there's a scene where, my mom never talked about dying with me. It was not something that I think she was able to really acknowledge that I was either, but the one time she kind of alluded to it, it was when she had that prayer book my grandpa had in World War II. And she said, if something happens to me, this is the thing I want you to have, Jessica. And I was like, let's not talk about it, Mom. I don't want to, I can't. And then we never really brought it up again. But I still have that little book, and it became kind of a talisman in a way for me. I mean, the talisman is a concept I use a lot in the book, and just ways that physical objects that are left behind can connect us to home or the people that we miss. That moment, and there's a moment when my mom gives me a bracelet that's a breast cancer bracelet, but also years later I realized it was just like the one she wore for her brother. Like there during Vietnam, any soldier that went missing, you got this bracelet from a company called Viva that would have the soldier's name, their date of loss, and when that soldier was returned home, you would mail the bracelet to the family as a thank you for their service. Usually the soldier had passed, right? My mother wore her brother's bracelet until it snapped in two from use. And after he died, I found it in this box, just like on top of a pillow, but just like snapped in half. And yeah, there's just ways in the modern moment that it was like conversations with mom, even after things, moments of realization where things she had touched or given me continued to have power. And I hope they still have power.
Wow. That's beautiful. If anyone else would like to chime in with a question, we have just a few minutes left. It's hard to know if anyone's typing away furiously with their question right at the moment, but
I have a question for you, Sarah.
oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So having your book made into a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio involved.
Yes. So that was actually I wrote the book concurrently while the screenplay was being developed. So I wrote some of the screenplay. I wrote the all the voiceover. It was by Amanda Seyfried. I don't know if you know, she's
cool. Yeah.
Good. Yes. She was great in it. But yeah, I was fairly young at the time. I was 22 when I wrote it. And they won female, another rare moment where being a young female worked for us. Yes, looking for more of those moments for the young females amongst us. But yeah, so I wrote it as, it was sort of this dual project with Warner Brothers and Little Brown at the same time that I was lucky enough to fall into. So, but it was great. It was really fun. And actually at a certain point, as I was finishing the book, they started filming the movie. So actually I could go down to the costume department and be like, what would that dress look like? You know, or let me touch that linen. So it all sort of, you know, the props, I could go to the props room and be like, what does that butter churn look like in fairy tale land? You know? So it was this sort of thing of the two. Yeah. You know, I love, you mentioned that you end with a quote from your father, and I thought actually that you would bring up, I love what you brought up, that part in the closing chapters, but I also noticed that in your acknowledgements, you acknowledge your debt to him for teaching you to ask questions of the world around you. I think that's such an important thing for you to be the guardian of this story and of the book. So that was good. He taught you that in advance of knowing that you would find this box, these boxes.
And Dad's also an attorney, so I should say. He's also now a singer-songwriter. He kind of had this midlife crisis that manifested in learning the guitar, being a drummer in a band, and recording an album, the whole thing. But, you know, to get your way as a little girl, you really, when your dad's a lawyer, you really have to learn how to argue and ask questions and kind of fight back. So I'm sure I was a total terror. I was the firstborn, but yeah, I think everything I learned about questioning the world, I kind of got from Dad. He wears like suits off to trial, and I remember I was always just rocking those things. It felt like this like power grab, you know. Although Mom rocked them too. She had the Liz Claiborne shoulder pad, 80s ones, like the big brass button.
They're coming back. Actually, I didn't realize when I was getting dressed that I look a little bit like I'm in a period piece or something here.
No, I'm loving all this space and the storage. Oh God, my Brooklyn apartment needs that.
Yeah. Yes. State, New York. But yeah, you know, and I thinking about your dad teaching you that, you know, just in closing, again, if he has one last question, you can throw it in right now, but otherwise we'll close out. But, you know, the book has often been called an excavation of this inherited trauma on a personal and federal governmental level scale. And, you know, I just think that I like that word for it, the idea. I like thinking of you with your pen sort of almost like a shovel, unburying and resurrecting the truth. So
I think while unburying myself, I think so much of this was processing the weight of a lot of this history.
Yes. Oh, that's amazing. Yes. Blooming, coming out like a flower. Ah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jess. That was wonderful. And please purchase this incredible book. You will not regret. Page turner. It is an up all night book, which we all want right now and need trapped in our houses. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, City Lit. And thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much for being here. It means the world to me to have my family story shared in this way. So thank you.
Thanks, both of you. It was a wonderful conversation. Everyone, this really is a great book. Please go to citylitbook.com and get it. Thanks. Hope to see both of you at City Lit someday. Thanks.
Yes, we look so forward to that.
Yes.
Yay.
Bye.
Counting the days. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.